Hey everybody, Psychosaurus is here and welcome back to Age of Empires Online. And today, well, I think it's time I finish those damn remaining stats. And so today I'll be talking about movement speed, snare, snare resistance, and snare immunity. So basically movement and the snare like impairing the movement. And these two, or three stats I should say, like movement speed is somewhat important, especially when we consider like caravans, merchant transports. We can definitely see how useful it's there. If you don't know how useful it's there, definitely watch my market and caravans video. It's definitely worth watching. In case of units, it's definitely worth having on melee units, because thanks to that, if you lose melee units, you can replace them faster because they go from the production buildings, whether it's barracks or stables, doesn't matter. They reach the battlefield much sooner thanks to the extra movement speed, and that's very useful. So yeah, let's start with the movement speed. And so yes, if we take a look at the unit, the movement speed, or in this case, as you can see at the bottom line, it's called only speed. Now, you might be wondering, what does this number mean? Well, as it is typical in a real world, speed means some distance traveled per certain amount of time. In this case, we can say, hey, it's 6 units per second. What 6 units? I'll explain it soon enough. But yeah, speed, the higher the speed, the faster the unit moves. That's very important. So you can see 6 speed is like this. Somewhat typical speed. If I take a look at this dog, it's 9 speed. You can see it's definitely faster than your normal spearman. But yeah, back to this one. So yeah, the more movement speed, the faster the unit moves. Now, you might be wondering, what does this number actually mean? How far is it actually, this 6 units, right? Yes, I was running the tests, although I was running it with houses before, but I think farm is gonna be ideal to show you, because every building has certain size, and if you try to place it and you're like moving it, you're not moving it like by like every inch you move by the same distance you'll move the buildings. No, the buildings are actually moved by the grid. That's actually, you don't really see it, but you can imagine it as if the world is like made of like these small squares, and when you're placing the building, you need enough of these squares, and they need to be freed so you can actually place the building there. That's how I would describe it. And yes, these squares we can use to actually define the distance. So when we are placing farm, you can notice that farm is like 3 squares, because you can move the farm a little bit. There's going to be like 1 space. You move it a little bit more, there's going to be 2 space. And once you move it by 3, that's already like you're behind the edge of the farm. So yes, if I can show it to you real fast. Okay, let me go. Farm, just so you have the example. You can see I'm moving it. It's not like every single distance every time I move the cursor. No, it's moving by certain amount. That would be the square. So if you see it, I place it right here. It's next to each other. I move it a little bit. You can see it's like this one unit. Let's say like the distance you see right here, that's like this, the side of the square that we are moving. So that's like 1 square, 2 squares, 3 squares. Okay, so that's the grid. Okay, so you can see that these squares are like certain size. Now, for this to explain it, you need to imagine that I let the spearman move for speed. I make the spearman move to the other edge of the farm, and unfortunately I don't have a timer here, so if you want to stop it for yourself, you can definitely do it for yourself. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna make it go over here, and you can measure it for yourself. So let's go 1, 2. This should be about 1 second. This this is what I did with my testing. I was using house, and what I saw was like the house is only 2 squares the size, so 1 less than what the farm is, and I would reach the other end of the house. So farms in this case are a really great showcase because I can move from this edge when I stand outside to this edge but standing inside. So that means I moved 1 square, 2 squares, 3 squares. Right? I move 1, 2, 3. Okay, I hope it makes sense. Okay, so yeah. In this 1 second, I've actually walked like the size of the farm. So that means that the 6 units is like size of the farm. So that means the size of 3 squares. That's pretty much how the distance is. Okay, and I don't think there's anything else needed to know about movement speed. Other than this, like how big it is, like, okay, 6 means, hey, in 1 second, I move from one edge to the other edge of the farm. So that's all you pretty much need to know. If I had like 9 speed, it would be like, I move to the edge of the farm and then just like 1.5 square further. That would be the case of the dog. So yes. Now another thing, yeah, I think I need to mention travel distance. Obviously, if I decide to go over here, it's gonna take some amount of time. And I just wanna say that if you double the speed, it does not mean, hey, I'm there immediately. No, you can see that. It would be impossible. No, it means that it will take only half the amount of time. Okay, remember that. And I just want to say that because people like using Zephyros for H1 advisor, and I keep saying it's not as good as it looks. And now, because I gave you how much 6 movement speed is, and that by doubling the speed, it does not mean that you reach this like immediately. No, it will take only half the amount of time. I just want to tell you, hey, try to calculate how much distance you would have to travel with Zephyros to actually make it really worth. Like you see, yeah, 25% carry capacity and 25% movement speed. So I just want to tell you, try to calculate how much effectiveness you're actually getting. I gave you like so many tools. Like you can check out my villager stats explaining how the carry capacity movement speed works there, and I was talking about the work rate. Now with this, how the movement speed works, you can calculate it more precisely. How, like for example, villager works for 10 seconds, then works 1 second there, 1 second back. And now try adding the Zephyros and try to figure out how much more effective you are with that. So that's all about the movement speed I have here. Okay, yes, okay. So next thing, obviously, is gonna be the snare. And snare is actually very close to the movement speed, because snare, what actually does, I would say it's somewhat useful, but you won't really need it in PvE that much. But yeah, when we consider snare, and spearman is ideal here, you see the number like 0.65 here. So snare means this number exactly. When the unit attacks enemy unit, it will reduce its speed to this value. So for example, you see I have 6 speed, and if my spearman would attack enemy spearman, same speed, like it could be enemy Greek spearman, I would reduce the enemy spearman speed down to 0.65 or 65% if you prefer. So that means I would reduce the speed by a little bit more than 1/3. So the enemy spearman speed would be only 4. That's how it actually works, and I will show it to you soon enough. Let me just switch this, so we are here. Now before I get to this test, I need to show you this. Next thing is stacking, because when you see snare, it actually works different way than most of the stats, because most of the stats you see like, hey, 10%, yes, it's extra 10%. Then you add another 10%, it would be 121% in total, right? Snare is actually one of those stats that actually is not adding it to the positive values, but subtracting it to the negative values. So here, Norse Bowman using Cosmos for the 20% snare. You can see it's, if I remove Cosmos, and sorry for that, you can see no snare at all. If I add Cosmos, it's not gonna be like 1.2, no, it's going down to 0.8, and as you can see, it's 20%, so minus 20%. And as most of the stats in Age of Empires Online, even this stacks multiplicatively. So if I add extra snare, obviously it's gonna reduce it even further, but because this is negative, if I add another 20%, for example, from this Bowman Champion upgrade, it will not go down to 0.60, but it will go down by 16%, because you take the 0.8 and then you multiply it by 1 minus 20%, so 0.8 again. And with that, you will get 0.64. As you can see, because 20% of 80% is 16, okay? So that's pretty much what I have to say about stacking the snare. So that's also important to mention. So the more snare you add up, obviously it's gonna keep getting weaker and weaker. It's not gonna be that good. And one thing I need to mention, stacking snare, although it might look interesting like against cavalry units, because cavalry have the high speed, so snare, the higher snare the better, there's limit how effective snare can be. And you can actually test this for yourselves if you try to play some legendary quests and you see those treasure camps with the sea people chieftains, or I don't remember what they're called exactly, but yeah, the normal non-event legendary camp, and you try to snare them, you will see that their speed does not go below 3. Their base speed is 3 if I remember correctly, and if you try to snare them, it will not go below 3. The 3 is the minimum movement speed any unit can move at. So if you have like dog with a lot of snare and you try to attack, for example, the spearman, it will not go below 3. So like dog with this snare already cannot snare the spearman more than by 50%, okay? So it will not go below 3. And you can test this for yourselves, okay? So you actually see this. Now, another thing. How is snare applied? Because one would expect, hey, I attack with melee units, the unit actually hits the enemy, it will get snared immediately. Makes sense, because there is no projectile. What about the ranged units? And this is what I've actually noticed, and I know about this for some time. And it's actually very interesting. And this will give you another answer for another thing, which would be units with splash damage, pretty much. So this is why I have this bowman here. I put the arrows of the Ice King snare here. We have Cataphract here with 8 speed, okay? Now the thing that I've noticed is that when the ranged unit attack enemy unit and they have snare, it's not that the snare is applied on the damage taken, it's actually applied when the attack occurs. So for example, in case of like melee units, when they attack, at the same time the snare is being applied. There's no projectile, or you can imagine there's super fast projectile that hits the target practically immediately. But in case of ranged units, like in this bowman, you will see okay, why aren't you attacking? Come on. You can see that the snare was actually applied when the arrow was launched. Okay, can I get away? Just so you see it again. Okay, why don't you attack it? See, it got fired, the unit got snared. So yes, the snare is actually being applied when the attack occurs. So in case of melee units, that's pretty obvious. In case of ranged units, that means when the projectile is launched. And that would be the same for units like, I mean, what's there really using snare? Like, for example, if you put arrows on towers, works the same way. You put it on, for example, chariot archers, works the same way. Now there are units with the splash damage, and since this is applied when the arrow is, or the projectile is being launched, that means that it will apply it only on the main target. Because how do you apply it to the splash damage when it's being applied when the attack is launched? At that time, you don't really know what it's gonna hit. So obviously, it can apply only to the main target. And this is true for fortresses, if you put the Ice King's arrows there. It's true for the arrow ships, same thing, when it attacks. And it's true for the Scorpios, if you have the champion upgrade on them. So all these units, they'll snare only the main target, okay, no splash. As you could see, the snare is applied when the projectile is launched. There is no way that you can tell which units will be hit at a time, so there is no way for you to apply it in the splash area. That's very important to mention. So even though it does not look that good on fortresses, remember, you're still snaring the main target before you even hit it, okay? So it's still somewhat worth it, but it's not gonna be that good as you might think. And the last thing, that's when you have, and I need to switch again to the player 1. Okay, close this. What if you have 2 units with different values of snare? How does this work? And this is again something that I have noticed and that had to research it a little bit further. So you have 2 units. For example, you could have the War Dog and probably not the Spearman, but let's say the Norse Bowman, because that is somewhat solid build. You go like Vemunder's dog, so you have a lot of dogs, and then you have the Bowman, which get the snare from the champion upgrade. That can be pretty standard situation when you're playing as Norse and doing that build. So you might be thinking, what's gonna actually happen? I have this unit, I attack it with dog, and then I attack it with spearman. What is actually gonna happen? Is it gonna be like, hey, the dog is gonna snare it, then it will run out, and then the spearman snare is applied? Or what else could be happening? Because that would be probably what you would expect, but that's actually not the case. And it's not the case that you would attack with the dog and then you attack with the spearman and the spearman snare would override the dog snare. That's not the case either. And you will see it if we attack it. So let's attack with the dog. Okay, and you can see Cataphracts keeps the reduced speed from the dog. You can see it's still keeping it. And there it is. You can see, you can tell it was from the dog because it was less than 50%, whereas the spearman had only 35%, so it would be much higher speed at that point. And so you can tell that if you have 2 units with the same speed, and I could probably create another spearman for this. So if you have 2 units with the snare, the first snare is what's being applied, and when you attack it with another unit with the snare, it will actually refresh the already applied snare. So if I attack with the spearman first and then with the dog, you can see it's still keeping it. it's still keeping the same snare. So if I attack with higher snare, when already the weaker snare was applied, it will just refresh the weaker snare. And vice versa, if I attacked with the stronger snare, the weaker snare will keep refreshing the stronger snare. So it is kind of unfortunate, because if you have the bowman with only 20% snare versus dogs with like 55% snare, it's good because bowman can refresh it, but at the same time the dogs will not apply the stronger snare. Now, like as I said, in PvE it does not really matter that much, because if you attack enemy units, they will attack the nearest your nearest unit anyway, so snare usually is not a problem. The thing about snare, it's useful if you're trying to protect your ranged units. So it's definitely good to have snare on your ranged units, because that will keep enemy units away from your ranged units. But otherwise, for melee units, it's not that good. Like, there could be like a scout unit, but who cares? That's just gonna scout, and your towers and defensive structures will take it out anyway. So at that point, like for melee units, it's not really worth putting the snare, but if you have ranged units, it's definitely good. And definitely like melee units can help you protect your ranged units as well, but that's pretty much the whole point of snare in PvE. In PvP, obviously, it's gonna be much more useful start, because killing those units early, where you just snare them and they cannot get away, that's gonna be very useful, because hey, every unit counts in PvP. So snaring them there is definitely worth, but in PvE, who cares, okay? And another thing, I think you can measure it for yourself, how long actually the snare lasts, because as you could see, if I attack the unit snare with another unit with snare, it will refresh it. So you can measure the time. I think it's about 3 seconds. I am not 100% sure, but I think that's the case. Should be like 3 seconds. And I believe that's all around the snare, I have to say. I don't think I forgot anything. And that means I can move on to the snare resistance. And I don't have any test for this here. So we'll move to the unit stats again. And for this, I'll use these numbers only. So basically, snare resistance, as you could guess, it's like a counter against the snare. So the snare is not as good. Now, the way it works, obviously, the higher the snare resistance, the weaker the snare is gonna be. It's not gonna reduce the duration, no, it's just gonna make it weaker. Now, the way it works, actually, and you can see it from the numbers here, if I have like almost 60% here, then I have another 50% here, and then another 15% here. If you scroll down, you can see that my snare resistance is 0.63. So from this, you can guess it. Snare resistance works the same way as armor. It works exactly the same. If I had 100% snare resistance, then this value would be 0.5. It works exactly the same. And just like I said how the snare works, you need to be careful how you apply the numbers, okay? Because the snare you see is actually, like for example, for the dog, it was 0.45, but the real snare is 55%. So you need to take 1 minus the value you see in the stats. So if I add the dog here, let me do that. So you have it. So yes, if you have the dog here, you can see 0.45. The real snare is going to be 55%. And so this number, the 55%, is the value that's going to get reduced by the snare resistance. So in this case, it would be almost 2/3, which would be, how much would it be? It would be like 40% down, wouldn't it? How much is it? 20%. It's like 11. That would be like yeah, 33, so like 35% down. So it would be like suddenly from 55% it goes down to 20%. Yeah, something like that. So definitely much weaker. And that's exactly how the snare resistance works. And then there is another stat, which is the snare immunity. And you can see this on few units. In this case, I have chosen Raider, but you can see it on the Celtic Champions, for example. If you are using Brenner's Advisor, you can see it on Vault Raiders with the Champion upgrade, I believe. I think they need Champion upgrade for that. That's what we have here. What we have this for? I think it's this. Yes, Snare immunity. And same goes for the Norse Berserkers with their champion upgrade, also granting them Snare immunity. And obviously, what's the difference between Snare immunity and Snare resistance? Now, obviously, Snare resistance works as the armor. The Snare immunity means that it was set the Snare resist over here to 1. So at that point, no snare is actually working. So you could imagine this is like infinite snare resistance, because obviously you would need infinite value for this to reach 1, okay? And as you can see, I have all these snare resist items here, and it's set at 1. So if I remove them, I remove the advisor, I remove the milestone, and you can see it's still at 1.0. So snare immunity, yes, do not put any extra snare resistance on your raiders. It's pointless, okay? It's a waste of good gear. And same goes for the other units that I've mentioned. Okay, so yeah, snare immunity, that means like infinite snare resistance. Your unit cannot get snared. If we consider snare resistance and you see like 100%, it does not mean that the unit is immune. It means the snare resistance is only 50% effective. Only 50%, okay? Like I said, snare resistance works just like the armor. Okay, and that's, I believe, all I have to say about snare resistance and snare immunity. I hope I did not forget. Definitely, if you feel like I forgot something, comment section is below. Tell me what do you think about these stats. Tell me your opinions. Did I said something wrong? I think I tried to explain it as best as I could. So definitely, if you enjoyed this, if you press the like button. If you want to see more, subscribe to the channel. And yes, these were the last stats, as long as I'm concerned. If you feel like I forgot any stats, or you feel like I did not mention any, definitely put it in the comment section. Maybe I could talk about those in some time in the future as well. But I believe I covered pretty much everything. So yeah, hopefully that's all. This was Psychosaurus. I'll see you next time. Bye!